Today's episode is sponsored by Rev, the productivity powerhouse for content creators, journalists, market researchers, and more. Capture audio from anywhere, get AI-powered summaries and quotes, and leave security worries behind with Rev. Whether you're on the go or in the office, Rev's got you covered. Discover more at rev.com. Hi, I'm Kendall Kelton, and I'm your host today on The Rough Draft. Featuring honest conversations with folks from across the creative industry, The Rough Draft explores the creative process, tools, and resources used by some of the best in the business. From journalists to content creators and business leaders, we shed light on what it looks like to break into the industry, make mistakes, collaborate with others, and the essential tools that help us all along the way. This week, I'm super excited to be talking with Casey Miner, an editor at Throughline, a podcast from NPR that explains the history behind current events. Now, Casey has spent most of her career editing podcasts for Planet Money, Wondery, and Reveal, to name a few. And she has taught narrative story structure at the University of California, Berkeley, and is co-founder of the Editors Collective, a group of narrative audio editors working to diversify the field and build networks and career paths for new editors. On today's episode, Casey shares her collaborative approach to editing and the creative techniques she relies on the most to bring her stories to life. Okay, so in your current role with Throughline at NPR, I'd like to kind of dig into like what is your process, especially in the early stages of story development as an editor.
Yeah, so NPR's Throughline is a show where I think you might broadly describe it as a history show, but we think of it more as being a time machine. Like if you're reading a story in the headlines, how did we get here? What took us to this point? Who are the people? What are the stories you might not have heard, or the people you might not have heard of who helped us get to this moment? And so one of the things that's cool about the show is we cover a very wide range of topics. Like in the past couple of weeks, we have done episodes about we did an episode about the Crusades, an episode about Christian nationalism in the US, an episode about the Third Amendment. We have an episode coming up about the origins of Thanksgiving. There's a broad, we've done episodes on K-pop, we've done episodes on smell. So, and we're a small team, we're about 8 people. And so one of the things we're thinking about, it's an hour-long documentary style show, which means that we're interviewing people, we're using music, and we're using a lot of archival sound. And those elements are integral to how we build the story. The hosts and creators of the show, Rund Abdel Fattah and Ramtin Arablouei, created it with sound as an essential part, right? So it's not the kind of show where we're sprinkling in a little music at the end. It's like the scoring and the archival sound and the scene building and the interviews and the writing are all part of it and all working together. And so when we're thinking about episode pitches and when I'm talking about those with the producer, part of what we're thinking about is, okay, how are we going to tell this story? What's going to keep somebody listening for an hour? What's propelling us forward narratively? Is there an archive of oral histories we can draw from? Are there writings we can dramatize? Is there an interesting back and forth between the hosts and the guests that we can include? So we want to be thinking about those elements from the beginning. So I talk with the producers ahead of time about what their pitches are. They bring them to the full team and say their ideas. And then once they get a green light from the hosts, we start figuring out, okay, like who are we going to talk to? Who's going to be our anchor guest? And part of what we're looking for there is someone who can tell us the story. Yeah. Who can tell us if there's characters, can they talk about the characters? If it's more like the development of an idea, are there scenes we can build out around that? We've done this whole series on amendments to the Constitution, which is sort of, it's like the transportation reporting of cinematic audio. It's like, how are you going to make the Third Amendment for an hour, right?
Right.
And part of what I talk about with the producers and, help them do is think about that. What are the stories that kind of show us what happened? What are the ideas we can talk about? How are we going to get through? How are we going to break it up into a 3-act structure? And so I sit in on the interviews that the hosts do, which is unusual. It's one of my favorite parts of this job. But, typically I haven't especially if people are recording in the field. Obviously, the editor is not going to be listening in on the phone or whatever. But because we do almost everything remotely, and because the interviews are so long, our interviews are 90 minutes to 2 hours.
Oh, wow.
It's really helpful as the editor to sit in, and we're talking on Slack the whole time. And right from there, I'm saying like, hey, this is a really good point. Let's dig in on this. Here's some follow-up information. And then once we've done all the interviews, we have a meeting where we storyboard and where we basically all sit down and we outline, okay, how are we going to open the show? What's the arc going to be? What's the takeaway from each part? What's the mood that we're going for? So we're thinking about sound and we're thinking about building the story. And then off they go and they make it. And it's unbelievable the work that the Throughline producers do. I mean, they're working with dozens of tracks in Pro Tools and, doing very intricate sound design and layering as well as storytelling with these interviews and this archival sound. We're also really trying to test the premise, whatever it is, our argument is, whatever story we think we're telling, history is complicated, right? And so we want to be sure that we're on solid ground. And in terms of what we're arguing, the producers make a draft that's around, between 50 minutes and an hour. And I will listen to the draft. And when it comes in, I don't look at the script or anything like that. I usually take a walk or do my dishes or something like that. I try to hear it like I would listen to an actual podcast that I was not working on.
And this is your walk and listen technique?
This is my walk and listen technique, yes. So I will walk around my neighborhood, listening and either writing on a notebook as I listen, making my notes, or sometimes I just am making the notes on my phone as I go. It's easier with a notebook. And so I'm sure many of my neighbors have seen me do this many, many times. But I really want to hear it that way because reading is a different experience. And there'll be a role for that later in the process to really go through the script and do that kind of line editing. Yeah. But I just want to hear it. What's boring? What's engaging? What's delightful? What's confusing? What's making me curious? And so I'm really paying attention to that. And then I make all my notes and have a meeting with the team where we kind of talk through all of that. And I give my big high level notes like, hey, I think this is working. I think we might need to talk about restructuring this. We talk a lot about the frame and how we're setting up the episode at the beginning to help listeners understand what they're going to hear. And then we go through multiple other revisions after that.
And I think you have your self-described kind of ethos around editing other journalists is it edits, not...
edits, not edicts. Yes, that is something that I will say too. And I think what I mean by that is there is a style of editing that some people have experienced and I think is probably more common in kind of like an old school newspaper environment. But, where the editor is like, their job is to come in and give orders, fix this, take this out, move that. Yeah. Yes, no, kind of come down from on high and tell you what it is you are and aren't doing. And that is not how I see the work. I see it as a collaboration from the beginning. And so what I try to do is to say, hey, this part isn't working. This isn't working for me. This part is confusing or this part is boring. Here are some reasons why I think that might be happening. Here are some ideas I have for what we could do to solve the problem. These are just ideas. If you have a different idea, we should talk about it. I think it's more important for me that we diagnose kind of what's going on and then we work collaboratively to figure out how to solve it.
Fact checking these days is a little bit of a hot topic, right?
Yeah, to put it mildly. Yeah.
So it is. And I could be wrong here, but I feel, at least from my point of view, is that it can, depending on the story, get harder and harder to do with so much information, mis or disinformation out there. So how do you or your team approach fact checking with your stories?
You're identifying a really good point. And I think one of the things that does help us is that we are a historically focused show, by which I mean that we are not reporting breaking news. We have a little bit of an advantage because there has been more distance between, there's more distance between our show and the stories we're trying to tell. And so I think we do it on a few levels. And the first one is that kind of checking of the premise. I'll take the Third Amendment episode that we did. The Third Amendment is the one about housing soldiers, the one that says you can't quarter soldiers. And so what do? Well, we start looking for people who study the Third Amendment. There aren't that many of them, but we found a few, right? And then we ask them, what do you think about the Third Amendment? Why is it important? Why should people care about it right now? What do people misunderstand about it? What might we be misunderstanding? Is the thing we're saying to you, does that sound right, or would you change it? And we do that with all the shows, with all the episodes. So we really try to understand, is the premise we're starting from even sound? And I think we're never trying to say it's definitive or it's the only perspective, right? I mean, history is very contested, as we know. It's more like, is this a plausible argument? Is this an argument that people who devote their lives to it have made? Is there archival support for this argument, this story that we're told? Is there archival support for this? And then when we get to the fact-checking stage, we work with an external fact-checker. We have them do kind of another layer of that. And our fact-checker is really, really great. He's very experienced. And so every line in the episode is getting fact-checked. So is this sentence that we wrote true? If our guest is making a certain argument, is that a plausible argument?
I just thank you for that. And what I would love to do next is actually, in our next episode, take a closer look at one of your episodes of Throughline and some of the kind of unique opportunities it presented. Well, that's it for today's episode of The Rough Draft. Be sure to rate and subscribe in order to stay up to date with the latest episodes, and visit rev.com/podcasts for even more content. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of The Rough Draft.